Thank you so much, Chelsea, for having me today. And I invite you to submit questions through the chat function, and we'll capture those at the end and hope to have a nice dialogue going here. Here are a couple of questions that the Humanities Washington encourages us to ask of you, the audience. So be thinking about these questions, and then at the same time, at the end, you can ask me questions or you can ask questions of your fellow attendees. So this is about Washington's undiscovered feminists and what defined feminism 100 years ago as compared to today, and how does your cultural heritage affect your definition of feminism? I want to give thanks to the Whatcom Museum and also Humanities Washington, and to remember to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency which supports programs like these in every state. I want to acknowledge that we are settled on land forming a Native American legacy dating back 11,000 years in the Pacific Northwest. Today, I will present stories of women in the arts and journalism in Washington in the early 20th century. They were pioneers, pathfinders, and breakers of stereotypes. I like to focus on the 1920s and 30s, the pre-war period, as a formative time for communities in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to encourage a comparison of political forces affecting women while sharing stories between cultural communities and recognizing women's lives across generations. The influences on these women's lives were many. The arc of history, world wars, control by patriarchal institutions, the church and the state, the family structure, conflicting points of view of foreign-born parents and their American-born offspring. And these resulted in controls on the right to vote, to work outside the home, to marry whom one wanted to divorce and remarry, or to not marry at all. 100 years ago, it was daring and even dangerous for women to speak out, to publish their writing and photographs, to examine gender discrimination, and to work outside the home for their own income. So sometimes I'm asked the question, why me? Why did I choose to pursue a path of activism? So let's see. You can try and guess which one I am, but I will point out that here I am at the protest against the Kingdom, the building of the Kingdom. And I'm kind of hidden down here, but if you can see my cursor, I'm in this position right here. And these were both demonstrations that were held in the International District in favor of low-income housing for residents of the International District in the 1970s. Women's history has been one of my passions through activism, writing, and creating art exhibitions. Since the 1970s, I have presented the history of women of color and women in the arts to my community and to the public. I began my activist career within the progressive movement in Seattle and helped to organize a study group called Seattle Third World Women. I was in many activist protests in the International District. At the University of Washington, as Asian Student Coalition president, I spoke against the bombing of Cambodia and Laos. And later, as a writer for the Seattle Times, I covered the early feminist movement in Washington State, and I was the primary reporter covering the Washington Women's Conference in Ellensburg, which some of you may remember, and the National Women's Conference in Houston, both in 1977. And I co-edited 2 anthologies of women of color writings. One was Gathering Ground, New Writing and Art by Northwest Women of Color, and another was The Forbidden Stitch, Asian American Women's Literary Anthology. and that was the first national Asian American women's literary anthology. Suffrage. The word suffrage comes from the ancient Latin word suffragium, or a petitioner's prayer on behalf of others. The right to vote, called women's suffrage, was new to many parts of the United States when the federal government passed the constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote in 1920. And we're celebrating that centenary right now in this month of August. And we're going to celebrate it by getting the vote out this fall. But in Washington State, the all-male legislature voted to give women suffrage first in 1883, and then on a technicality, they voted again in 1888. So imagine, this is Washington State I'm talking about, had passed the bill for women's suffrage in 1883, many, many years before the national vote of approval in 1920. So imagine in 1888, this was only 20 years after Seattle was incorporated as a tiny town with a population of 1,000, and then legal maneuvering set that vote aside, and finally by a statewide popular vote, which means male voters, our state constitution was amended to give Washington women the vote in 1910. Thus, Washington became the 5th state in the entire nation to provide the right to vote to women. But what were the previous 4? Not states with big urban centers like New York, California, or Illinois. They were Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. So you might think about that a little bit for our chat period. Why were these Western states the first to vote for the women's right to vote in popular ballots? And every step along the way, there were political battles inspired by national women's suffrage speakers like Susan B. Anthony, who spoke right here in our state in 1871. And with committees of women, hearings, lobbying, leaflets, and mass marches. These are all the things we do today to achieve political change. So what is feminism? What does the word feminism mean? The notion of feminism is probably the key building block in raising women to achieve these steps of change, like the right to vote. Feminism is a whole range of political movements, ideologies, and social movements that share a common goal, and that goal is to define and achieve political, economic, and personal equality of the sexes. Feminist movements have campaigned and continue to campaign for women's rights, including the right to vote, to hold public office, to work certain types of jobs, to earn fair wages or equal pay, to own property, to receive an education, to enter into contracts, to have equal rights within marriage, and to have maternity leave. Feminists have also worked to ensure access to legal abortion and to protect women and girls from rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. Changes in dress and acceptable physical activity like sports have often been part of feminist movements around the world. Today, I'd like to present to you the lives of exemplary Washington pioneer women of that pre-war period 100 years ago, and to let you decide if their interesting lives and achievements in arts and journalism amount to feminist acts. And they are Imogen Cunningham, a photographer and chemist; Priscilla Chong Jue, an artist and craft shop owner; Vi Hilbert, a Native American language preservationist; Anna Louise Strong, a pro-communist journalist; and Ruby Bishop, a jazz singer and pianist, and we will hear some of her music in a few minutes. The photographer Imogene Cunningham was born in Portland in 1883, and she was the fifth of 10 children. She grew up in Seattle, and in 1901, at the age of 18, Cunningham bought her first camera, a 4x5-inch large format camera. She entered the University of Washington. With the help of her chemistry professor, she began to study the chemistry behind photography, and she subsidized her tuition by photographing plants for the botany department, as you see here, a photo of a succulent. Cunningham refined her style, taking a greater interest in pattern and detail, and becoming increasingly interested in botanical photography like flowers. In 1907, Cunningham graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in chemistry. After graduation, Cunningham went to work for the famous photographer Edward S. Curtis in his Seattle studio, learning the portrait business and practical photography. Cunningham worked on the Curtis project of documenting American Indian tribes for his famous set of books, The North American Indian, which was published between 1907 and 1930 as a very large format set of books. Cunningham learned the technique of platinum printing under Curtis's supervision and became fascinated by the process. In 1909, Cunningham was awarded a graduate fellowship to study at the Technische Hochschule in Dresden, Germany, where she helped the photographic chemistry department find cheaper solutions for the very expensive platinum printing method. At the age of only 27, Cunningham opened her own studio in Seattle and won acclaim for her portraits. Most of this work placed sitters in their own homes or in her living room or in the woods surrounding Miss Cunningham's cottage. I believe that cottage was near the Arboretum. She became a sought-after photographer and exhibited at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences by 1913. The next year, she married Roy Partridge, a teacher and artist, and between 1915 and 1920, Cunningham continued her work and had 3 children at the same time. In 1920, the family moved to San Francisco. Cunningham then became more interested in the human form, particularly hands, and she was fascinated with the hands of artists and musicians. This interest led to her employment by Vanity Fair, that is the same Vanity Fair magazine that exists today, and she photographed movie stars without their makeup, which was very radical at the time to see movie stars without their makeup. In 1934, Cunningham was invited to move to New York to work for Vanity Fair magazine. Her husband said no, he wanted her to wait until he could travel with her, but she refused and they divorced that year. In 1945, Cunningham was invited by Ansel Adams to accept a position as a faculty member for the art photography department at the San Francisco Art Institute. In the 1950s and 60s, she continued her nature photography work with other leading photographers such as Edward Weston, who was working on photographing the entire Yosemite National Park. Cunningham died in 1976 at age 93, just after her work was exhibited at a major photography festival in France. And her archives are stored by her granddaughter on Lopez Island. And I was lucky enough to visit that studio. Priscilla Chong. Priscilla Chong Jue was a fiber artist and a gallery shop owner. Priscilla Wong, her name then, was born in 1916 on the Kitsap Peninsula near Olalla. I hope someone out there knows where Olalla is. And her town's name actually was Fragaria, which is what she loved to say, the Latin name for strawberry. And here we see a really fun picture, a photo of her, Priscilla, with some of her sisters, I guess 3 of her sisters, on a horse out there on the farm in Olalla. Her parents had no idea of English names, and so their older daughter asked her school teacher for a name, and thus came Priscilla. Her father was a Baptist minister from the Guangdong region of southern China and a very early Chinese convert to the Baptist faith. The family came to Seattle in 1909, right at the time of the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, a very large, intricately constructed international fair on the UW campus after it had moved to the Montlake area. Priscilla's mother, the daughter of a dry goods shop owner in China, was quite the entrepreneur, and seeing all these potential customers at the fair, decided to open a shop in downtown Seattle, bringing over beautiful embroidered clothing and gift items from China. And those of you that know downtown Seattle's history might know that her shop was right around the corner from the original Frederick Nelson department store. And by 1931, the family opened another shop with Chinese goods as part of the Western Washington Fair at Puyallup. And Priscilla ran it by herself for 30 years. The family also managed a Chinese gift shop as part of the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. She says, her mother did not speak much English, but was great with customers, good-tempered and hardworking. During the Depression, the family ate a lot of sauteed peanuts and lettuce over rice. We could buy 5 heads of lettuce for a dime at the end of the day, she said, but after that, I could never eat cooked lettuce again. So here's a cool picture of Priscilla with, I believe, a tie-dye fabric. Priscilla married the noted Chinese artist Fei Chong, pictured here, who helped to organize exhibitions of the Chinese Painters Club in Seattle's International District. She developed fabric designs and exhibited and sold them. Her textile designs included block prints, tie-dye, weaving, and batik. She exhibited her work at the early Bellevue Arts and Crafts Fair, along with her husband, Fei, who showed his paintings. The couple had 3 children, and after Fei Chong died suddenly at the age of 61, Priscilla married Willard Zhu, a Chinese community historian and herbalist. Unfortunately, her husband Willard died after just a few years. But even into her 80s, Priscilla Chong Jue's interests, besides her artwork, were designing and constructing parade floats and costumes for the University District Parade, ice skating, and Hawaiian dance. She died in 2012 at the age of 96. Vi Hilbert was a Native American language preservationist. She was born Vi Anderson, a member of the Upper Skagit tribe, in 1918 near the small town of Lyman in Skagit County. Her father was a master canoe maker and a champion canoe racer. He and her mother spoke the Lushootseed Puget Salish language. This is the language of Chief Sill, whom Seattle is named after. As the family moved from one small town to another, often as fruit pickers, her mother coaxed stories out of the native people, and Vi learned and treasured them. After attending so many schools, she opted to enroll in the Indian boarding school in Salem, Oregon, and then to finish high school there. She eventually married 3 times and had 3 children, 2 of whom survive. Her many jobs in Washington included berry picking, ironing, housework, running a pool hall and cafe, processing pears in a cannery, a stock clerk, a cookie wrapper for a Danish bakery, an electric welder at Todd Shipyards, cashiering at a food wagon at Boeing, a secretary at Children's Orthopedic Hospital, and also as a hairdresser. What a talented and hardworking woman she was. In 1967, she met and agreed to help the linguist Thomas Hess transcribe and translate early Lushootseed recordings of elders. She learned to read and write this language, which she had only learned as an oral language, and eventually taught the Lushootseed language and traditional stories at the University of Washington. The UW Press published 3 of her books. Then she established her own publishing house, the Lushootseed Press, to continue publication of her many volumes of native language books, such as stories and dictionaries. Vi Hilbert taught for 15 years at the University of Washington and 3 years at Evergreen College, and many of her students became Lushootseed teachers. She shared her native traditions with institutions such as the Burke Museum, Seattle Art Museum, and the United Indians of All Tribes. She received many awards, including recognition from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Vi spoke Lushootseed with every audience she addressed, especially traditional gatherings, so that this ancient language can be heard throughout Puget Sound, where it has been spoken for centuries. Vi Hilbert passed away in her home in LaConner in 2008 at the age of 90. Anna Louise Strong is one of the most notable radical women journalists in the history of the United States. She was born in Nebraska in 1885, the daughter of middle-class liberals who were active in missionary work and the Congregational Church. A gifted child, she raced through public school, then studied languages in Europe. She graduated from Bryn Mawr College, did graduate work at Oberlin, and at age 23 earned her PhD from the University of Chicago. As an advocate for child welfare for the United States Education Office, she organized an exhibition and toured it extensively throughout the United States and abroad. When she brought it to Seattle for 6 months, starting in May 1914, it attracted more than 6,000 people per day, and many of them women. Unable to find solutions for the needs of children and the working class, Strong concluded that capitalism was at fault and became an avowed socialist. She was 30 years old when she returned to Seattle to live with her father, the Reverend Sidney Strong, pastor of Queen Anne Congregational Church. She favored the Seattle political climate at the time, which was pro-labor and progressive. She also enjoyed mountain climbing and led climbing parties up Mount Rainier. When Strong ran for the Seattle School Board in 1916, she won easily thanks to support from women's groups and organized labor, and also because of her reputation as an expert on child welfare. She was the only female board member. She argued that the schools should offer social service programs for underprivileged children and that they should serve as community centers. But the other school board members did not agree. In the year of her election, 1916, the Everett Massacre occurred. Strong was hired as a stringer by the New York Evening Post to report on the bloody conflict between the International Workers of the World Union, which we call the Wobblies, and the army of armed guards hired by Everett mill owners to keep them out of town. At first an impartial observer, she soon became an impassioned spokesperson for workers' rights. Strong's endorsement of controversial liberal causes set her apart from her colleagues on the school board. As a pacifist, she opposed war, and when the United States entered World War I in 1917, she spoke out against the general draft. On the one hand, the PTA and women's clubs joined her in opposing military training in the schools, and on the other hand, groups of military veterans branded her as unpatriotic. Strong's fellow school board members were quick to launch a recall campaign against her, and they won by a narrow margin. Strong became more openly associated with the liberal press, writing forceful pro-labor articles and promoting the new Soviet Russia government. In 1919, 2 days before the beginning of the Seattle general strike, she proclaimed her support for the strike, which shut down the city for 4 days and then ended as it had begun, peaceful and with its goals still undefined. Disillusioned with the indecision of the US labor movement, Strong began to travel as a foreign correspondent for radical American newspapers. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Strong ventured into China, parts of Asia, and throughout the Soviet Union, interviewing ordinary workers and people in the street, as well as senior Soviet leaders. She visited Spain in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War and accompanied the Soviet Red Army into Poland and victoriously into Nazi Berlin when the Nazis were defeated in 1945. She also visited China during the latter stages of its War of Liberation in 1949. After World War II, Strong was arrested in the US on espionage charges. She was freed, and after another visit to the USSR, that's Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which does not exist anymore, and she went in 1955. After that, she settled in China in 1958 at the age of 72, where she was one of the few Western journalists to gain the admiration of Chairman Mao Zedong. And here you see this photo on the left is a photo with her, with right next to the Chairman Mao and Chinese revolutionary leaders, as well as the very famous African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois in 1959. Du Bois is the one, as we see to the right of Chairman Mao. She died there in China in 1970 at the age of 85, having written more than 30 books based on her journalistic work and travels. And now we're going to have a little music interlude. Just a minute.
Let's tickle some ivories now. Please welcome local jazz legend Ruby Bishop.
Ooh, sugar, I call my baby my sugar. I never maybe my sugar, because my baby is so confectionery funny. I never plead for his money, and when I treated one, honey, he's the best in his line. I'd make 1,000,000 trips to his lips if I was queen, for he's sweeter than any candy to me. He's granulated sugar. I never cheat on my sugar, for I'm so sweet on my sugar. That honey baby of mine. If I was a queen, for he's sweeter than any candy can be. He's granulated sugar. I'm so sweet on my sugar. I never made my sugar. That honey, baby of mine. That honey, baby of mine. Oh, he's so sweet.
Okay. Well, I almost started singing along, but it's probably better that I didn't. This is Ruby Bishop, the legendary jazz singer and pianist who was born as Ruby Carol Cogwell in 1919 in the town of Rochester in Thurston County, Washington, and that is a little south of Olympia. And she lived among other notable Black pioneer families. Some of you might know that the city of Centralia was founded by the outstanding Black businessman, George Washington. She was the 8th child and worked on the family farm, dancing for county fairs at the age of 5 and mostly self-taught on the piano. She led the Centralia Buccaneers band at the age of only 12. After graduating from high school, her parents sent her to the University of Washington, where they hoped she would be trained as a pharmacist. Within a year, she left the university, choosing a music career over the pharmacy. Settling in Seattle in the 1930s, Bishop played solo gigs at many of Seattle's well-known jazz venues. One of her big influences was the piano player Fats Waller, who invented the stride piano. And that song you heard is a type of stride piano playing, which is a subset, a type of ragtime. Because of restrictions imposed by the White Musicians Union, Black performers were limited to the south part of town around Jackson Street. This restricted area was where the touring jazz greats could stay, perform, and hang out. Over the years, Bishop befriended and hosted many of these performers who looked forward to both her music and her home cooking. These greats included Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and especially Louis Armstrong, whom she often escorted about town when he played in Seattle. Although she didn't become a pharmacist, she married one, Alex Bishop, whose shop was in the International District. And during World War II, like many women in her era, she became a Boeing B-17 mechanic and draftsman. After the war, she learned stenotyping. Okay, you younger people will not know what stenotyping is, but it's a type of court reporting on a tiny reduced typewriter. Then she studied to be a beautician. She held many jobs to support the family. However, she always looked at her nighttime music career as her main profession. Over time, others recognized her musical ability. By the time she was nearly in her 50s, Bishop had achieved enough recognition to be recruited by the US Army to entertain the GI troops stationed in South Korea and South Vietnam. By this point, she had also performed before audiences in London, Paris, and Stockholm. Despite that success, Bishop viewed Seattle as her home. By the mid-1970s, both national and international travel became less frequent. After her first husband died, Ruby Bishop married a second time at the age of 82. I'm not sure how many children she had, but she does have 8 grandchildren. And after that husband died, she returned to performing regularly at Vito's Lounge on Madison Street. It's the restaurant that's there right now on Madison Street. And she earned a spot in the Seattle Jazz Hall of Fame in 2016. She was 99 years old when she passed away this past June. So, oops. Going back to the questions, I'll just remind you of some of the questions that came to my mind as I was putting together this talk. And one of them is, what were the major issues of feminism 100 years ago and now? And how about what barriers for women of 1 century ago still exist today in the world? And here's your extra credit. In view of changing demographics, can women unite under varying definitions of feminism? So I want to point out that it is impossible to decide on a single definition of feminism because a woman's struggle to find a place in the world is rooted in and reflective of her own experience. Has contemporary American feminism primarily come to mean championing women's personal autonomy and challenging the privilege of male over female? What common goals can diverse women work on together? I want to thank you very much for joining me this evening, and we'll get over to the questions in the chat section. Thank you very much. So I will go back to, I think I'll go back to the first slide. There. So Chelsea, you can tell me if you want me to stop screen sharing.
Yeah, so feel free if anyone has any questions to put that up on the questions tab down below for Mayumi. And Mayumi, if you wish to keep this up, I will maybe wait a couple minutes here in case anyone has any questions for you.
Okay, well, maybe you have a question.
Let's see, wow, great presentation. I learned so much, thanks. Awesome. I will say, so everyone who joined us today, you will be receiving a survey shortly after the presentation. Humanities Washington really appreciates all feedback. And, you know, we want to thank, obviously, you, Mayumi Tsutakawa, for taking the time to present to our, you know, museum patrons and to us here in Bellingham. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. We have a question here. Is Imogen Cunningham's collection with her family member ever placed on exhibit here in Whatcom County?
The very, very special and beautiful work of Imogene Cunningham has been requested to be shown in many different museums around the world. And I want to point out that the Seattle Art Museum is going to include her work in an exhibit, I think next fall or next winter, but that will be a very important occasion. It is possible that the Whatcom Museum has shown the work of Imogene Cunningham in the past, but I don't know of specifically any exhibits that are coming up. And Chelsea, I don't know if you want to mention that or how in the future you might announce that. But I haven't heard of any of those coming up. But please watch for the Seattle Art Museum exhibit of Imogene Cunningham in, I don't know, next winter or something, maybe next spring. Sorry, I don't have the specific date.
And I'm sorry, I don't know that myself either.
Okay, thanks for that question though.
We have a question from Robert Blackwell. What can we, those who aren't scholars or researchers, do to learn about and promote these and other undiscovered feminists?
Well, all of the women that I spoke about definitely have a web presence. And for example, for the ethnic specific sources, Priscilla Chong Jue definitely would have information and some of her artwork at the Wing Luke Asian Museum. And Vi Hilbert, of course, is very well known and prominent for her work that's been collected by the University of Washington and also Evergreen College. In the case of Anna Louise Strong, as I mentioned, she published over 30 books that were based on her journalism traveling around the world, and especially as one of the first women journalists that covered the Soviet nations and communism. And in the case of Ruby Bishop, again, as one of the very wonderful African-American women jazz artists, her information is captured by the Earshot Jazz organization and also the Northwest African American Museum. So that just gives you a few of the directions that are available.
Thank you, Mayumi. Another question here by Helen Cooper. Do you feel that Western women gained more autonomy because they were part of pioneer families and their contributions to family survival showed how essential they were?
Yeah, I think by Western you mean West Coast or in the Western states, well, okay. And so that's an interesting question, and I was hoping that we would come back to that, and that is why was Washington why were the 5 Western states the first 5 to vote for women's suffrage? And by the way, the last one that was needed to ratify the national legislation was Tennessee. But at any rate, yes, I think that in the West that women so often took part in hard pioneer labor work. And you can't always assume that their husbands were present. They could have been widowed or divorced or abandoned or single and still owning a farm or a business, raising livestock and so on. And I think that in the West, now I wasn't there, but I'm going to say that I think that there was a real respect for hardworking women and that they very, very much deserve credit for raising their families as well as doing hard work outside. And it's one of the points of discussion that came about when I gave this talk somewhere else was that possibly in the Western states there was a real lack of women at all, and perhaps the male voters felt that it would be an incentive for women to move out west if they were given the right to vote. So those are just a couple of ideas. Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I have a raised hand in our list here. Okay, by allowing women to vote, there would be more state votes, and therefore have more effect on presidential elections.
Okay, this question has come up, and I believe I found the answer, and that is that in the states that voted for the women's suffrage prior to the national legislation, their votes did not count for the presidential and national elections. Their votes only counted for those statewide elections and issues. Did that get at the question?
Yeah, thank you.
I also want to point out that right now, this month of August, there is quite a bit of discussion and special issues, sections, for example, in the New York Times about this entire cycle of women's suffrage and the entire 100-year history. So please do look for other sources. The major news sources nationally definitely have covered it. So.
Thank you, Mayumi. Let's see. Someone just commented 100 years ago, as today, feminism is the radical notion that women are people.
Yes, I agree. There were many, many examples of outstanding women who had access to education, of course, women who did not have access to education, but yet became strong community leaders all across Washington and in Native Indigenous communities, in Black communities, in Asian communities, in every kind of community, and not just the ones that sort of stand out are church communities, of course, but in education and social work and so on. There were many, many notable women who I would have to say were not given the microphone. They were not given the prominence that they probably deserved. And I'm starting into a new field of research to try and find out what was happening with my mother's life during that time period. So more on that later in the future.
A follow-up question, was the word feminism used to describe the ladies you spoke about during their time?
I don't think that any of them would have called themselves feminists, except possibly Anna Louise Strong, because it was not within their community lexicon, you know, the vocabulary that their families or their churches or neighborhoods that they commonly use. I spoke about the mothers of some of these individuals, and I don't think that they would have called themselves feminists, but because I know that I think that feminism was associated with electoral politics, and they all probably found that they could achieve more and do more within their particular sphere of interest, and they mostly did that.
Thank you. We have a question. Where on Lopez Island did you say we could view Imogene Cunningham's work?
Okay, well, if you look up Imogene Cunningham on your internet, you will see that there is an official website for her collection. This is not open to the public. But I do want to just describe it a little bit. It's a beautiful, this is the granddaughter of Imogene Cunningham. It's a beautiful farmhouse and a beautiful new building that they built to hold the archives, including the original negatives and original printed photographs of Imogene Cunningham as well. So they are capable of printing new photographs from the negatives. They also have her original cameras, including the very big heavy cameras that she carried when she went hiking in the mountains. These are really large. And then the cameras she held in her own photography studio. But you would have to be a real scholar and maybe a representative of a museum to write to the family, to the director of the archive, and ask them for permission to visit. It's not a public site.
I included the website on the Q&A so people can click on that as well.
Oh, thank you.
Their official website.
Yeah, I mean, you can learn a lot even just by looking at the website and studying information about her.
Thank you. Is it possible for a professional photographer to visit her archives, do you think, as well as a scholar?
Oh, I think that you need to just write to them. The director is Meg Partridge. I mean, in no way do not represent them. I cannot say on this on this Zoom call whether you can go there or not. So you will have to write to them and see what they think.
Thank you. It's probably best to check in with.
I was going to say a few more words about Imogene Cunningham. A lot of you must know about the American artist Ruth Asawa, the Japanese American woman from San Francisco or the Bay Area. She spent her last years in the Bay Area, who created the beautifully created sort of wire basket sculptures. And she was awarded, her memory was awarded by a set of stamps just this week. They've been issued. She was another really great activist woman of the earlier period, woman artist. And she and Imogene Cunningham were good friends. Imogene obviously was older than Ruth Asawa, but in the new books about Ruth Asawa, that's ASAWA, there are many beautiful, wonderful photographs by Imogene Cunningham of Ruth Asawa. They were neighbors. They both lived in the Bay Area. They were among the leading women artists of that period. And it would be an interesting study just to know what were the relationships between these really cool women artists of that period of the, say, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and to know how they collaborated together. So that's just a little side information about her.